What do coins have to do with the rise of global religions? We're going to find out today. Welcome to Champagne Anarchism. Welcome back to this series on David Graeber's Debt, the First 5,000 Years. Today we are covering chapters 8 and 9, which is a really big deal because we are getting into Graeber's summation of kind of the great ages of money. Today and next week, we're going to look into the various historical ages that Graeber uses to break down his arguments about the rise of coinage. He goes through four. He goes through the First Agrarian Empires, which are from 3500 to 800 BCE. Then the Axial Age, which is 800 to 600 BCE to CE, the Common Era. And then the Middle Ages, which goes from 600 to 1450 CE. So that's getting us into the so-called Age of Discovery, right? And then the capitalist empires, which is from 1450 to Richard Nixon, who ends convertibility of gold in 1971. So over the course of these four chapters, he's going to break these down and explain exactly how they fit into his overall arguments, which have to do with coinage and the ways that they've influenced the general trend of humanity. So we have a lot to get through, and to be honest, I may end up splitting the next two chapters, chapters 10 and 11, into their own separate videos, just because we do have so much to cover in those chapters. But I'm still sorting out the scripts for those, so we will get into that when we get into it. For now, we're definitely today going to cover chapters 8 and 9. And I'm breaking this down into four different parts. So first of all, we're going to look at Graeber's core argument here, how he breaks down these different ages and why. Second, we're going to get into the agrarian empires, and we're going to follow Graeber on this. We're going to look at Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China, just quite quickly, try to sum all this up, pull it all together. Third, we're going to look at the Axial Age, which is a very specific term that Graeber uses. We'll talk a little bit about that then. But we're going to be looking this time at Greece and Rome, India, and China. China again, of course. China always comes up. And then finally, we're going to come back to that core argument and see how Graeber is presenting this, what his takeaways are, and how we should start shaping these ideas in our minds. Again, because there is a lot more to come over the next four chapters. So there's a lot to get through here. But let's go ahead and dig right in. And we'll start with the core argument. Right. Graeber's core argument in chapter 8 is that the history of the world can be, or the history of Eurasia specifically, but he's extending this, can be roughly broken down into phases. You have ages of credit money. We've talked about this before, which were built on trust and tend to look a lot like the human economies that we've been describing and we've looked at in previous chapters, and ages of bullion, where gold and silver, hard currency, are used. So you have the age of credit money, and then that falls away and it gets replaced by an age of bullion, and then that falls away and it gets replaced by another age of credit. So we go through these kind of cycles. There's a lot of thinkers out there who will frame the history of the world rather in these types of cycles, and Graeber is buying into that very noble tradition. So we're going to look at that and look at what it looks like in Graeber's taxonomy. So in these two chapters, we're going to think about why these ages of credit money break down. And simply put, Graeber's argument is that they break down because of war. So that is to say, credit money that exists before this, these kind of credit arrangements based on debt and money as an accounting unit, that's all based on trust. When that trust starts to break down, you start needing gold and silver pieces. And the benefit of that hard currency should be pretty obvious to us, right? You can weigh a gold piece, you can weigh a piece of silver and find out exactly how much literal gold you're handling. Also, these precious metals tend to be valued by generally everybody in the nearby area, so even if it's stamped as a coin or it's not stamped as a coin, chances are you can probably exchange it for something else. So on one hand, when you enter this period of an unpredictable future, when you enter a period of war, a period of famine, rulers are overthrown, trade routes are severed, cities are sacked, all of this stuff, you will turn to something that goes beyond simple trust and these networks of trust. But there is another part of this. Because what is the other thing that you can do with gold and silver? You can steal it. Graeber makes the argument that a lot of the empires during the Axial Age, the Greek city-states, Athens in particular is the one he looks at, the Roman Empire, the empires and republics of India, etc., were essentially propped up by an apparatus of war that goes out, sacks other places, brings back that gold and silver, and then distributes it to people back home. And this is also important to remember as well, because as we looked at, and we'll talk about it a little bit more today, those early empires, especially in Mesopotamia, for example, debt forgiveness was kind of baked into the system. It was a very frequent fixture. It always keeps popping up in our records of ancient Mesopotamia, because if you didn't forgive debts, then people would rise up. Now, this also happens during those Axial Age empires, right? It happens all the time in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, but if you become an empire that's based on extraction, then you can kind of push that off, right? You can steal gold and silver from elsewhere, you can disseminate it among the population, and you can stave off crisis, an uprising, people coming to topple your government. And underneath all of this is a commodity that requires very little trust to keep circulating. And that is, of course, because it's all based on a precious metal. Graeber writes, "For much of human history, then, an ingot of gold or silver, stamped or not, has served the same role as the contemporary drug dealer's suitcase full of unmarked bills. An object without a history. Valuable because one knows it will be accepted in exchange for other goods, just about anywhere, no questions asked." Now, there are two dimensions to this transition from one age to the other, this kind of warlike transition. The first thing is that coinage, gold and silver being coined and used as currency, tends to go along with military expansion. And that should make a lot of sense. We've talked about this before already in this book. And we've talked about war as well, right? And obviously, it is great to be able to ransack your enemies, but also if you are building the massive professional armies that start to appear during the Axial Age, you need to pay them. So easy. Mint some coins and steal the gold and silver for your coins from your enemies. The second part of this transition, this kind of complex that we're building here, is slavery. This is another thing that we've talked about before. Actually, just last week we talked about slavery and the way that slavery underpins a lot of this system. All of this goes hand in hand with a massive expansion of the enslavement of humans and their use to prop up these early militaristic empires. When Graeber talks about this, you see him talk about a very specific phrase that keeps coming up, and that phrase is the Military-Coinage-Slavery complex, similar to the modern military-industrial complex, but all of this goes together, right? Military, coinage, and slavery. They are three sides of the same, I don't know, triangle. A three-sided dice. That doesn't exist, does it? I don't know. But either way, that's exactly what it is. All of these things work together to give us what becomes, for example, the Roman Empire, an empire that is based on military expansion and conquest, that is underpinned by effectively an empire based on slavery, and of course uses coinage to make all of this work. So that, in brief, is the rough contour of Graeber's main argument. Now let's spend a couple minutes talking about the First Agrarian Empires. So, Graeber combines Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China into the Agrarian Empires section. I won't get too deep into any of this, especially since we've talked about Mesopotamia quite a bit already in this series, but in ancient Mesopotamia, around 3500 BCE, the first currencies were just literally lines pressed into clay tablets, and then those clay tablets were sealed in clay envelopes. And you have temple accountants basically tallying things like barley and silver and livestock as units of account. These are not, again, to be traded out in markets. They are basically a record, a web of obligations that are holding society, early Mesopotamian society, together. And money, therefore, is an abstraction. It's basically a bookkeeping device for your promises to others. And of course, those debts can get out of hand. They always get out of hand, right? You will have, and we've talked about this before when we talked about the Jubilee phenomenon, but you will quite easily find people going into debt bondage, debt peonage, just like this. This whole system will occasionally ensnare people, and so to keep the debt peons from uprising and overthrowing your government, you have to think about debt cancellation. And in this way, debt cancellation became everything in these early societies. Rulers would literally and symbolically wipe out debts. And of course, with that comes the idea of freedom, of liberation. If you think of debt as a sin, we've explored this a little bit as well. If you think of debt as a sin, something you're in bondage to, then a debt cancellation is also just metaphorically wiping the slate completely clean. Your soul is cleansed, although we'll get to the idea of the soul in a little bit. And Graeber also mentions in this section that this is where we get the first appearance of the word freedom in a political document, which is related to debt cancellation, and it appears in early Sumerian records, which is really cool. So that's Mesopotamia. On the other hand, you have Egypt, which takes a radically different path. For most of ancient Egypt's 3,000-year history, Egypt manages to avoid this kind of corrosive spiral of interest and debt, but it's because they have a very specific mechanic at work here. So the pharaoh's economy at this point is running on essentially rations and record keeping, not really on credit markets. So unlike in Mesopotamia, where you could get a literal loan as a trader or merchant from the temple, Egypt doesn't really work like that. They're not really extending commercial loans. Grain is in ancient Egypt both food and money. It's measured, it's stored, it's distributed through state granaries that literally keep the country alive. And money in Egypt, and this is similar, exists mainly as a standard of account, not circulating cash. It is a little bit weird to think about it in this way because Egypt is not an economy or an empire that is built on speculation, which is something that you could say about Mesopotamia. It is built on essentially measurement and distribution. And of course, this is proof that you can organize a complex civilization with tremendous top-down control rather than relying on market economy that we would recognize kind of as a market economy in modern times. But let's move past Egypt and go to China quickly as well. China, and listen, we don't know too much, but Graeber is pulling what we do know from anthropological and archaeological evidence and saying, listen, China was much more of a ritualistic gift exchange than a market exchange. We know that in the early Chinese dynasties, wealth was expressed often through gifts and cowrie shells, for example, which passed among different elites as tokens of status and tokens of alliances. These are instruments not of commerce, not of purchasing things, but of meaning, of significance, of influence. So to give a gift under these terms is to create a bond, to acknowledge some kind of connection. And that is kind of key, right? The early Chinese money, as far as we know, wasn't about buying things, it was more about sustaining relationships. And that's just all to say that it reflects hierarchy and reciprocity, but not profit. So across these early civilizations, you have money, but it's money as basically trust made visible. It is ultimately kind of an act of social imagination, if you will. But it does require that level of social trust. And as social trust begins to break down, so do these units of account. And before we leave this section, let's not forget that other crucial element of all of this, which is debt cancellation. It is present through this entire history, and Graeber reminds us that the Rosetta Stone was erected to proclaim a debt amnesty, both for debtors and for prisoners. It was declared by Ptolemy V in 196 BCE. So that's just something to consider. Let's turn to the Axial Age, though. So the Axial Age, as a phrase, comes from the philosopher Karl Jaspers, who noticed that Pythagoras in Greece, of course, Confucius in China, and the Buddha in India all came around roughly the same time, and that there are commonalities to this period of history, at least in the Eurasian continent. It's actually a pretty useful way to think about this particular time in Eurasian history, and there are a few ways that you can break down the actual dates of the Axial Age. For Graeber's purposes in this book, we are looking at a period of time between 800 BCE and 600 CE. Oh, and by the way, in this book, Graeber uses BC and AD. Me, because I don't know why, because that's just what I learned. I'm just woke as hell. I don't know what to tell you. I use before the Common Era and Common Era, so BCE and CE. That's a minor difference between this video and the book, so don't get too thrown by that. But this is all just to say that it will take us up through the fall of the Roman Empire and into the Middle Ages. So Graeber here in this chapter is looking at the Mediterranean, so Greece and Rome. He's looking at India and China. And in all these three places, the story of money turns bloody. You have Athens and Rome as particularly salient examples. These are the ones that Graeber is pulling out of nations that are built on expansionism. Both, Graeber tells us, face early debt crises, especially when the tension kind of reaches a breaking point. And when that tension does reach a breaking point, the ruling class, in both cases, came up with a common solution, which is conquest. So Athens, for example, has a legendary navy. It's an empire that is founded on its navy, and its navy is funded by minting silver from conquered mines. Rome built its legions on, actually there was some debt arrangements that went on in the beginning, but Rome built its legions that then went on to conquer the rest of the continent based on loot from other lands that was then distributed amongst those soldiers. Expansion and conquest, I should say. Expansion and conquest become basically a safety valve for debt concerns. So if you can continuously pull in loot into your empire and distribute it, you don't have to deal with the consequences of a debt crisis because the people will be appeased, assuming they buy your currency. And they will buy your currency if you use gold and silver. And by the way, that might sound a little familiar to you. It's the year 2025 as I record this video. We are currently living through an age of unprecedented global debt that is fueled by the expansion of markets, the expansion of credit, and the never-ending quest for GDP growth, which is based on both of those processes. And Athens and Rome were built on literal slavery, and our modern economies run on people who need to work to survive. So there are a lot of parallels here. At the end of this series, we are going to discuss modern financial capitalism. And I'm going to make the rough argument there that the drive for consistent GDP growth built on debt markets, which are, of course, built on lies and exploitation, it isn't exactly equivalent to the conquest of the Axial Age. And Graeber, of course, very clearly separates these two periods in time. And Graeber, of course, will talk about the capitalist empires that are going to appear on the horizon post-Middle Ages. So we will get to that when we get to that. But even though those mechanisms, the kind of hyper-financial reality that we live in now, and the conquest of the empires of ancient Greece and Rome, they are different, those mechanisms, but there are a lot of things in common. So that's just something to keep in the back of your mind, I suppose, as we go through the rest of this series. Maybe as you read this chapter, or if you've already read this chapter, think about how these modern parallels, these Axial Age empires going out to conquer because they need to fend off debt crisis. Think about the potential similarities and differences between our modern day reality that we're living through right now and what I would definitely call a sort of late stage capitalist hellscape. Just again, something to have in the back of your mind as you go through the rest of this book. Anyway, here we are getting into this book into the shape of the military-coinage-slavery complex. War creates money. Money creates armies. Armies create slaves to produce more wealth, which goes back into the system. The whole system is fueled by violence. Graeber writes that, quote, "In fact, the entire Roman Empire at its height could be understood as a vast machine for the extraction of precious metals and their coining and distribution to the military, combined with taxation policies designed to encourage conquered populations nations to adopt coins in their everyday transactions. India actually follows a very similar pattern, though its empires and its republics kind of wrap the machinery of war in the language of a cosmic order. It's very, very interesting. So you have small republics and kingdoms that kind of along the Ganges that begin minting coins to feed their armies and also to stabilize tribute. And then as conquest expands, you have thinkers who sort of take this logic of coinage and start to apply it to bigger questions. The thinker that Graeber focuses on is called Kautilya. He's the author of the Arthashastra, and I can only apologize for my pronunciation, but he essentially reduced politics to a matter of calculation. So that is mapping every relationship, every favor, every human act onto this logic of exchange. So the marketplace for Kautilya and the battlefield are effectively two sides of the same coin. Now, by the time of Emperor Ashoka, the tension between conquest and morality had become kind of untenable. So Ashoka turns to Buddhism to fuel his later empire. He basically does an imperial reboot to move away from conquest, which founded his empire, and turn to Buddhism. He does this massive renunciation of violence, although, of course, he preserves the empire's sort of bureaucratic and military machinery. That's, a turn to Buddhism was not a complete turn to Buddhism here, but it is nonetheless interesting, and Graeber is going to use this to underpin a later argument that we'll get to in just a second. Meanwhile, in China, you have the Warring States period, which is an interlude between these major dynasties. So the Warring States period, you get kind of a different version, but similar military monetary engine. You have these regional kingdoms that are fighting for dominance with these absolutely enormous professional armies. Unlike Greece and Rome, however, China's coinage doesn't include gold and silver. So this is a little bit different. What China uses are these bronze pieces that have holes put through them. And so to pay someone multiples of these bronze coins, you have to string them together and give them to people. And it makes kind of big transactions very, very difficult. You have stories of people giving gifts to rulers by taking these ox carts full of bronze coins strung together. So the logic of coinage is the same, but it's much smaller scale. They will still be used to pay military units, but also it keeps things from getting maybe too big, maybe too powerful, maybe too out of hand. Just a little bit of friction in those kinds of big transactions. Anyway, so that is a quick summary of the dynamics that we've got at play here with China, India, and the Mediterranean. Let's take a few more takeaways away from this whole story, though. Let's put these two pieces together, because Graeber marks these at the end of chapter 9 as materialism 1 and materialism 2. Let's go right back to that core argument. Now, as markets spread and the military coinage slavery complex is churning right through empire after empire, something begins to shift in the way people thought about, we could say, the way people thought about value itself. These philosophers, these thinkers, these moralists of the Axial Age, the ones that so inspired Karl Jaspers, people in China, India, and Greece were trying to make sense of what was essentially a new type of human being. And that's a type of human being that is, for lack of a better word, countable all of a sudden. We've talked about this logic before, this logic of money, this logic of the marketplace, this thing that can make us commodify human beings. All of a sudden, and also if you went through the series that I did on Murray Bookchin or the series that I did on Silvia Federici, this may all sound quite familiar to you. At this time, this coinage, which is what Graeber assigns this phenomenon to, coinage starts to prompt people to think about things in a way that is quantifiable and countable, and it it leads to a split, kind of a metaphysical split, something that will eventually become Cartesian dualism, right? Mind and body. That should make some sense to us, right? And Graeber points this out in the course of this chapter as well, that if you're a Greek philosopher at the time looking at a coin, you say this is a physical substance that represents an abstract concept. Couldn't the human body, couldn't our physicalness be subject to similar rules? That might sound like a little bit of a stretch, but bear with me here. So what Graeber is saying is that as coins replace credit, all of a sudden the moral imagination of these philosophers had to change. The pursuit of profit becomes less of a personal temptation, a kind of quest for something, and more of a literal worldview. You get this way of understanding why people act, what motivates them, and what the world itself is actually made of. We talked about India, but in China, you have a very similar thing going on. So in China, you hear this kind of new language taking shape in the writings of philosophers like Lu Buwei, who described how soldiers were always looking for profit. And if you could convince the soldiers on the opposite side that death awaited them, they would leave the military and look for the next most profitable thing. So you get this clear thinking, right? All of a sudden, as soon as coinage comes around, human motivations become more quantifiable. They become more subject to mathematical rules. If you live in a human economy, there are any number of motivations. If you live in a coinage, a market, a commercial economy, there's just one consideration at the heart of everything, and that's money. So across the world, philosophers and thinkers are starting to wrestle with kind of the same tension, right? If everything can be priced, then what room is there left for virtue and for duty and for love, right? You have the cold economic calculating logic of the market, and that starts seeping into everything else, the way that people conceive of morality. Profit is more than just an economic motive. It's now an existential motive. You can think of this as Adam Smith's invisible hand being reimagined as a cosmic principle. But Graeber says that even as this is materialism, of course, even as this materialism takes hold, you have a backlash immediately. You have a natural reaction or a resistance to these materialist ideas. So you have philosophers in the Axial Age, especially the Buddhists, the Taoists, the Platonists, whatever you want to pick out of here. And again, we'll come to this potential criticism at the end, but it's very tough to kind of sum all these up into one big picture. But all of these different thinkers were all in their own ways kind of searching for substance in a world that had reduced everything to exchange. And Graeber's insight here is that the materialism is still there. It still underpins all of this. You still have this kind of mind-body division, this dualism, and these thinkers are not rejecting exactly materialism. They're just transforming it. And you get this division. And so when we think about this idea, right, Graeber is saying that coinage prompted this split. Coinage prompted these philosophers to start thinking of everything in mechanical terms and to start with what would become the mind-body split, the dualism that we know from René Descartes. All of this originates in coinage and the understanding that everything about our lives is quantifiable. That's an enormous argument. That's a huge argument. It spans literally the entire continent and thousands of years of history. But Graeber says, listen, of course, the Axial Age philosophers are not all about coinage. Coinage is not directly influencing absolutely everything, the way that they think about these things. There's a lot going on with this early philosophy. But as a starting point, you do need to consider coinage and the ways that it changed the way we think about human interactions and human experience. You have to start, in other words, from the idea that all of a sudden, all human relationships are quantifiable. Now, at the end of chapter 9, Graeber very kindly kind of lays out his final argument here, point by point, 8 different points. And if you are just watching these videos, you're not reading along in the book, I actually really encourage you to go to the end of chapter 9 and kind of read through these points. They're very clearly laid out, and they're really, really interesting. But it's worth going through them point by point real quick. So first point, markets emerge and they become entangled in military affairs. Second point, the military-coinage-slavery complex gives rise to the materialist philosophy. We just talked about that. Third, philosophers start looking for new explanations that's based on materialism of the human soul and morality. And then fourth, those philosophers start to find common cause with the rising social movements that have been formed to face off against these new elites. Now, fifth, you have these movements and their philosophers turning into peace movements, which are rejecting the politics of violence. Then, number 6, you have a natural impulse to come up with a morality that's based on this new impersonal morality of markets. These attempts fail. This is the backlash that we just talked about. 7th, rulers embrace religious ideas that reject the earthbound morality of the market. Again, think of Ashoka turning his government to Buddhism, right? This is something that initially these governments may have rejected, but now it actually really serves their purpose to embrace these new religions that are starting to rise. And 8th, you land where we are today with the division of different spheres of human activity. So you have the human activity that concerns the market, and then you have the human activity that concerns the soul. You have the material market and the soul-bound sort of religious side of things. Two sides, but from the same origin. And so in the end, Graeber's Materialism 1 and Materialism 2, the search for profit, the pursuit of profit, and the search for substance, they're just kind of two different answers to the same question, which is, what is value? What do we value? One literally counts it, the other feels it, right? And history, Graeber reminds us, is always kind of swinging between the two. Now, we are going to continue to explore this story over the next 2 chapters, but I am curious what you make of this explanation. Over on the Patreon channel, again, quick plug, patreon.com/champagneanarchism. But over on the Patreon channel, on our 100 Great Anarchist Thinkers series, we've gone through some of the early proto-anarchists. And if you've watched any of those videos, you will notice that it is actually incredibly difficult to pin down their thought. Not least because the Qin dynasty burned a ton of records when it unified China after the Warring States period. But in any case, and in every case, this is very early philosophy that we don't have a lot of context for. So Graeber's summation of all of this is absolutely fascinating, but it is ultimately just that. It's a summation, right? And it's a summation of worldviews and philosophies that are incredibly complex and very rich, and to some extent inaccessible to our modern eyes. So my big broad question here is, do you buy this idea that the coinage of these early empires gave rise to the roots of our modern religions? That's a very, very big question, but it is one that we have to wrestle with, and one that we will continue to wrestle with through the next video, and also honestly the rest of this series, and God, there's everything else that's going to come, the books that come up. There's always this kind of question at the heart of, what does coinage and literally the market do to our understanding of the world and our understanding of morality? So that's the big question I'm going to leave you with. More to come next week. I will see you then. Thank you.